We brought this question to the text. YHWH, give us the latest Bible prophecy news on the war in Persia, Elam, Edom for this time today. The lead verse came from Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 9. For they all made us afraid, saying, their hands will be weakened from the work, so that it is not done. So the first sound in the draw is fear. The opening tells us that the adversary seeks to weaken the hand before he stops the work. He seeks to make the servants of YHWH look at the noise and forget the wall. Yet the draw does not end where it begins. The verdict set over the draw is yes, affirmative. So the fear named in Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 9 is a warning, but it is not the final answer. Hear first how often the draw speaks of sons, inheritance, and priesthood. Genesis chapter 46, verse 12 names the sons of Judah in the land of Canaan. Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 9 says Moses wrote this law and gave it to the priests, the consecrated sons of Levi, who carry the ark of the covenant of YHWH. Joshua chapter 22, verse 9 speaks of priestly inheritance. Nehemiah chapter 11, verse 20 says the residue of Israel, the priests, and the Levites were in all the cities of Judah, every one in his priestly inheritance. This means the question about Persia, Elam, and Edom is answered through covenant standing. The Father is speaking about who his people are, and what inheritance he has set before them. Then hear the thread of appointed season. Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 14 counts the years until the men of battle were consumed. Jeremiah chapter 36, verse 23 speaks of the roll cut and cast into the fire until all the roll was consumed. Galatians chapter 4, verse 2 says, until the time appointed of the Father. Acts chapter 2, verse 20 says the sun will be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and manifest day of YHWH appears. Isaiah chapter 13, verse 10 speaks of the stars, the sun, and the moon giving no light. So the draw says this is not a loose hour. This is an appointed season. Things are moving toward a day set by the Father, yet the day itself has not appeared. Now come to the direct word touching Edom. Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 22 says, he will come up and fly as the eagle, and spread his wings over Bozrah, and on that day the heart of the mighty men of Edom shall be as the heart of a woman in her labor pains. That is not a small touch. Edom is in the draw. Bozrah is in the draw. Mighty men in travail are in the draw. So the text gives an affirmative witness that the war around Edom belongs inside this inquiry. The draw also gives the sound of battle. Jeremiah chapter 47, verse 3 speaks of the stamping of hoofs, the rushing of chariots, and the rumbling of wheels, so that fathers do not look back because of feebleness of hands. Judges chapter 10, verse 18 asks, what man is he that will begin to fight? Judges chapter 8, verse 6 speaks of bread for the army. The field is not hidden. The draw knows the sound of war. It knows the strain that falls on the hand. But the draw does not leave the servants of YHWH under fear. Isaiah chapter 8, verses 11 and 12 says, you do not say, a confederacy, to all to whom this people say, a confederacy, and its fear you do not fear, nor declare fearful. That word stands across from Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 9 like a lamp before the feet. Yes, fear is present. Yes, nations gather. But the covenant people are forbidden to bow before the fear of the hour. Then the draw turns and strengthens the heart. Enoch chapter 39, verse 9 says the covenant faithful and elect before him shall be strong as fiery lights, and covenant faithfulness before him shall never fail. Luke chapter 2, verse 25 speaks of Simeon, covenant faithful and devout, waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the sacred spirit was upon him. Mark chapter 6, verse 20 says Herod feared John because he knew he was a covenant faithful man and a holy one. So the answer is not merely that war is moving. The answer is that the covenant faithful are to stand in the midst of it with lamps still burning. There is also a grave warning in the midst of the yes. 2 Chronicles chapter 24, verse 20 says, because you have forsaken the covenant of YHWH, he has also forsaken you. 2 Chronicles chapter 24, verse 21 shows the prophets stoned in the court of the house of YHWH. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 30 says, vengeance belongs to me, I will repay, says YHWH. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 20 says, I will hide my face from them, I will see what their end shall be. So the affirmative word is not careless. It does not flatter flesh. It says the Father is speaking, yet he is also judging. Isaiah chapter 19, verse 14 adds another layer. YHWH has mingled a perverse spirit in the midst, and they cause error in every work, as a drunken man staggers in his vomit. Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 5 says there is an error that proceeds from the ruler. This tells us that confusion among rulers, disorder among nations, and crooked counsel in the midst are not outside the hand of YHWH. The drawer sees not only battle in the field, but also error in the gate. Still, the center of the answer remains affirmative. Isaiah chapter 10, verse 22 says, "Though Israel be as the sand of the sea, yet a remnant shall return, and the consumption decreed shall overflow with covenant faithfulness." Isaiah chapter 11, verse 16 says there shall be a highway for the remnant of his people. Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 11 remembers that YHWH divided the sea and threw the persecutors into the deep as a stone into mighty waters. The drawer says there is consumption, yes. But there is also remnant, return, and a way made by YHWH. The priestly thread must not be missed. Exodus chapter 13, verses 11 and 12 speaks of the firstborn consecrated to YHWH in the inheritance land. Numbers chapter 18, verse 19 gives the sacred offerings to the priests and their sons and daughters. Genesis chapter 47, verse 22 says the land of the priests was not purchased. 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 32 speaks of the altar built in the name of YHWH. Acts chapter 7, verses 48 and 49 says the Most High does not dwell in houses made with hands. So the Father is not only speaking about war in lands far off. He is calling his people back to priesthood, consecration, altar, and true dwelling before him. What then is the response? Joel chapter 1, verse 14 answers, "Consecrate a fast. Call a solemn assembly. Gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land into the house of YHWH Elohim, and cry to YHWH." Psalms chapter 98, verse 4 says, "Make a noise to YHWH, all the earth." Psalms chapter 92, verses 2 and 3 calls for declaring his goodness in the morning and his faithfulness night. So the answer is not accusation against brethren as in James chapter 4, verse 11, but prayer, assembly, praise, and steadfastness. Daniel chapter 5, verse 15 says, "You can make interpretations and dissolve doubts." So here is the plain answer. Yes, the text gives an affirmative witness concerning the war in Persia, Elam, and Edom for this time. Do not let your hands be weakened. The remnant shall return. The verses drawn in this Shield 17.14 session were Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 9. James chapter 4, verse 11. Genesis chapter 46, verse 12. Isaiah chapter 19, verse 14. Enoch chapter 39, verse 9. Job chapter 18, verse 20. This concludes today's interpretation under the Shield protocol.